Travel itself, that's actually just the fun part, right? The hard part is finding the money to do so. So let's talk about what those numbers look like. I'm going to share 2 examples of other bloggers who've talked about this, and then I'm going to share some of my real expenses so that you can start saving for your own adventure. Okay, let's start at the big question here. How much money am I going to need to travel the world? Well, the answer is relatively simple. It's probably not as much money as you think. So to illustrate this, let's start with some of the extremes. I recently heard a quote from an inspiration of mine, Chris Gilbo. He said that when he went to his first 100 countries, it cost him $30,000. And at first I was like, holy crap, $30,000, that's a lot of money. And then I thought about it. Well, $30,000 got him to 100 countries, so that's $300 per country. And I was like, well, that actually is really, really cheap. In fact, it costs me more when I travel, so what am I doing wrong? It's important to note that with Chris, he's traveled to every single country in the world, and I mean that honestly, not like hyperbole. He hit Norway, which is his 293rd country, I think about a month ago. He's kind of an extremist. He travels super light and with lots and lots of travel hacking and all these kinds of things. So I use this as kind of a gauge for what I should be doing, roughly 300 per country, but that doesn't take into account cost of living and food and all these kind of other things. So I use that as a rough gauge, but then use other examples in my own personal experiences to get something a little bit more realistic. So what are you supposed to do if you're not a crazy experienced traveler? Well, let's look at Alex McCaw. He just finished a around-the-world trip. He went to 17 countries and he spent a year traveling. If you're curious, he supported himself by writing a book for O'Reilly about programming. He said he spent $22,000 to do this. Now, $22,000 is a lot, but not when you spend it over the year to cover everything. This covered his airfares, covered his food, this covered everything, like I said, right? Now this seems something like a little bit more reasonable and easier to attain. I know from personal experience, I spend more than $22,000 to be at home in Seattle over the course of a year, right? So this gives you a little bit more insight. So let's use that and then combine it with the number from Chris, and then I'll share some of my own experiences and what that's looked like. Now, when I first started traveling, I went to Buenos Aires, Argentina, and I went and lived there for 6 months. Now, BA is kind of a different place because, say, 5 years ago, it actually used to be very, very cheap for expats, for people living there. And from what I understand, the locals who do live there now, it is generally relatively inexpensive. It's still a developing country. But for expats, it's going to cost you a lot more. You got to pay for hotels, you got to pay for like the not local rate for food and all these different things. So when I was there for 6 months, it cost me $15,000. Now, that also included a bunch of different bucket list items: Easter Island, Carnival in Rio, the Panama Canal, a bunch of different ones. So the money that I actually spent there was close to about $10K for the 6 months. But keep in mind that $15K number. My next big trip was Barcelona, Spain, which is of course in Europe, which is a much more expensive place to live than, say, South America. That cost me also $15,000, but I only got 3 months out of it. Now, I did a bunch of other trips as well. I think I did about 6 or 7 different countries and major events up there. But I was only able to spend half the amount of time, 1, due to money constraints, and 2, because of visas. They only let Americans be there for about 3 months at any given time. Now, I'm intentionally going to keep these numbers bigger than they probably should be. The reason I'm doing this is because as a traveler, 1, you got to pay higher expenses for things, and 2, there's just a lot of unknowns. I've found that you run into lots of things, visas, just like crazy tickets and all these other things that normal locals don't have to pay. So I'm keeping these numbers bigger than they probably need to be. Now let's start with Europe. Europe is by far the easiest continent to travel in, but it's also the most expensive. Now it varies a lot depending on the West and the East. Eastern countries, but generally speaking, I try to prepare $4,500 US for a month in Europe. And of course, this will go down the longer that you're there, but this is kind of my range, $4,500 US. That's a little bit pricey. So let's talk about South America. Clearly, it's cheaper to live in South America. I mean, there's an exception in Buenos Aires and, say, Rio and maybe a couple other major cities, but generally speaking, it's cheaper to live in South America than it is in Europe. So for this continent, I save $2,500 per month of travel. Now, again, this goes down as you stay there longer, but I've felt very comfortable and lived quite well and actually eaten really, really well off of $2,500 a month in South America. Let's say you want to go a little cheaper. Hell, I don't blame you. Southeast Asia. So there's, again, a couple hot spots there as far as prices. Hong Kong is very expensive, Singapore is very expensive, but there's many entire countries that are going to be quite reasonable. So for Southeast Asia, I am saving about $1,750 per month. So $1,750 US per month as my cost of living for travel and lodging and food and everything else that comes up. So those are the actual numbers that I've had to spend as I've been traveling, but I know there's a lot of variations. You could travel more luxuriously and you could probably travel a lot cheaper as well. And also, I mean, just to be fair, I'm not covering a lot of really cool places like India, Africa, like Central Asia. So I'd really like to hear what all of you know. Let me hear your insights. So if you have any other, if you want to talk any of the money, although I know that'd be kind of awkward, or if you want to just give me some ranges, I'd love to learn from you by having you share your insights in the comments below.